It's 11:37 p.m. LaGuardia Airport, New York City. Runway 4 is lit up in the dark, those long amber and white lines stretching out into the black. A regional jet is on short final approach, wheels almost touching the ground. 72 passengers on board, 4 crew members, a routine flight down from Montreal, just minutes from landing, just minutes from home. And then, in less than 1 second, everything went wrong. What you are about to hear is not a story from some distant past. This did not happen decades ago. This happened 3 days ago, on the night of March 22, 2026, at one of the busiest airports in the entire United States. 2 commercial aircraft pilots were killed when their plane struck a massive airport fire truck on an active runway. Dozens of passengers and crew were rushed to hospitals across New York City. The runway was closed indefinitely. Hundreds of flights were cancelled, and air traffic control audio captured a moment so raw, so human, so devastating that it stopped aviation professionals around the world cold. Tonight, we are going to go through every single second of that night, the chain of events that led to this collision, the decisions that were made, the decisions that should have been made, the warnings that came too late, and the question that every aviation expert, every air traffic controller, and every nervous flyer in America is now asking. How on earth did this happen again? 40 minutes, that's all I'm asking for. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand this story better than most people in this country, and you are going to understand why what happened at LaGuardia Airport on March 22nd was not just a tragedy, it was a warning. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened that Sunday night, you first have to understand who was on this flight, what kind of aircraft they were flying in, and what kind of day it had already been before the wheels ever left the ground in Montreal. Air Canada Express Flight 8646 was a scheduled passenger service between Montreal, Trudeau International Airport in Quebec, Canada, and LaGuardia Airport in New York City. It's a short hop, barely over an hour in the air, the kind of route that business travelers and families fly all the time without giving it a second thought. Montreal to New York, bread and butter flying. But here's something a lot of people don't realize about Air Canada Express. It's not actually operated by Air Canada itself. The express service, those shorter regional routes, is operated by partner airlines flying under Air Canada's brand, and the company operating Flight 8646 that night was Jazz Aviation. Jazz has been flying regional routes under the Air Canada banner for years. They're one of the largest regional airlines in Canada. And the aircraft they use, the one on this flight, is the Bombardier CRJ-900. Now, if you've ever flown a short domestic or transborder route in North America, there's a decent chance you've been on a CRJ series aircraft. They're everywhere. Narrow-body regional jets, built by Bombardier up in Montreal, kind of fitting for this story. They seat between 76 and 90 passengers, depending on configuration. They're efficient, they're reliable, and they are absolutely standard across dozens of North American airlines. The specific aircraft on this flight, Canadian registration CGNJZ, was carrying 72 passengers and 4 crew members, 76 lives in total. Now here's where the night was already off to a rough start, before a single wheel left Canadian soil. The flight was scheduled to depart Montreal at around 8 p.m., but it didn't. There were weather-related delays rippling through the system that evening, and Flight 8646 sat at the gate. Then sat some more, passengers waiting, growing frustrated, the way you do when a 1-hour flight turns into an entire evening. By the time that CRJ-900 finally pushed back and rolled toward the runway in Montreal, it was 10:12 p.m. Eastern Time, over 2 hours late. Think about what that means for the people on board. These are passengers who expected to be at LaGuardia before 10 p.m., probably catching cabs or subways home, maybe meeting family, maybe getting to a hotel before a Monday morning meeting. Instead, they were now on a flight that wouldn't land until close to midnight. Tired, probably a little irritated. Maybe some of them had fallen asleep in their seats. What those 76 people had absolutely no way of knowing What nobody on that plane could have possibly anticipated is that at the other end of that flight, down in New York, a completely separate situation was already unfolding. A chain of events that was quietly, invisibly, aligning itself into a catastrophe. And it started with a smell. At 11:18 p.m., about 20 minutes before Flight 8646 would touch down, a United Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 8 was sitting on runway 4 at LaGuardia, preparing for departure. Flight 2384, bound for Chicago, O'Hare, full of passengers ready to go home. The crew pushed the throttles forward. The jet began to accelerate down the runway. And then they stopped. The pilots rejected the takeoff. An anti-ice warning light had illuminated in the cockpit. Now, that alone, under certain conditions, can be enough to abort a departure. Ice protection systems on commercial aircraft are not optional. They are life-critical. If there's a warning, you don't take chances. But then something else happened. A smell began spreading through the cabin, a foul odor, not something you can diagnose instantly. It could be minor, could be significant, but in a pressurized metal tube flying at altitude, you do not ignore odors. And then the flight attendants began feeling ill. The crew declared an emergency. Now the situation on the ground at LaGuardia started to get complicated. There was no open gate immediately available for the United flight to pull up to. The passengers couldn't just walk off through a jet bridge, so airport emergency protocols kicked in. An airport rescue and firefighting vehicle, in aviation, they call it an ARFF truck, was dispatched to the scene, along with a stair truck, to help passengers deplane directly onto the tarmac if needed. Now I need to stop here and make sure you understand what an ARFF truck actually is, because this matters enormously for what happens next. An airport rescue and firefighting vehicle is not what most people picture when they hear the word fire truck. This is not a red truck from your neighborhood firehouse. An ARFF vehicle is a machine designed for one of the most extreme environments imaginable, a burning commercial aircraft loaded with thousands of gallons of jet fuel. These things are massive, armored, essentially. Built to crash through debris, to operate in the middle of a jet fuel fire, to absorb impacts that would destroy a normal vehicle. A fully loaded ARFF truck can weigh 40 pounds or more. Some models go higher. They are, as one aviation expert later described them, essentially tanks, built to survive, built to be, for all practical purposes, immovable. One retired incident commander put it simply, if you hit that thing, the truck is going to win. At 11:37 p.m., Truck 1, the ARFF vehicle, was in radio contact with LaGuardia Tower. The crew made their request. Truck 1 and Company LaGuardia Tower, requesting to cross runway 4 at Delta. And the air traffic controller gave them clearance to cross. Runway 4 at taxiway Delta, cross the active runway, you're cleared. That clearance was given at 11:37 p.m. Air Canada Express Flight 8646 was on short final approach to runway 4, 76 people, wheels seconds from touching down, at a ground speed of somewhere between 93 and 105 miles per hour. The truck had clearance to cross. The plane was about to land. And at that moment, both of those things were true simultaneously. The controller realized what had happened almost immediately. In the audio that was later released, you can hear the urgency, the raw panic, in the transmission. Stop, 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 stop. But a 40,000-pound truck does not stop in an instant, and a commercial jet on short final, 93 miles per hour, wheels coming down, cannot pull up and go around with zero warning. It was too late. At 11:38 p.m., Flight 8646 touched down on runway 4 at LaGuardia Airport. According to flight tracking data that was later verified and refined, the aircraft was traveling at a ground speed of approximately 81 to 91 knots at the moment of impact. That's 93 to 105 miles per hour. I want you to actually feel that number for a moment. 100 miles per hour. That's highway speed. That's the speed you're going when you're in a car on the interstate and you look down at the speedometer and think, maybe I should slow down a little. Now imagine not a car, but a 40-ton commercial aircraft, steel and aluminum, full of human beings, traveling at that speed. And directly in its path, a 40,000-pound armored firefighting vehicle sitting on the runway. The nose of the CRJ-900, the cockpit, struck the ARFF truck. The impact was catastrophic. The front section of the aircraft, the cockpit and the forward galley area was, in the language of investigators, destroyed, not damaged, not bent, destroyed. The two pilots, the captain and first officer, were killed. Both were young men, both Canadian, both, in the words of FAA Administrator Brian Bedford, at the start of their careers. The Aviation Authority confirmed their deaths early Monday morning. Their names had not yet been formally released as families were still being notified. Administrator Bedford called their deaths an absolute tragedy. That's not a press release phrase. That's a man trying to find words for something that doesn't have adequate ones. Now behind the cockpit, in the main passenger cabin, the story changes. The cabin survived the collision, not intact, not undamaged, but it held together. The fuselage behind the cockpit section did not collapse. 39 passengers and crew members were injured. One flight attendant, who was strapped into her jump seat at the front of the cabin, reportedly fell through an opening in the aircraft when the nose section physically separated from the rest of the fuselage. She survived. According to law enforcement sources who later spoke to reporters, the majority of injuries were broken bones and bruises, but one passenger suffered a brain bleed. Others had more serious trauma. In total, 41 people were transporting to hospitals across Queens and the surrounding area. By Monday, 32 had been discharged. 9 remained hospitalized with serious injuries. The two Port Authority firefighters inside the ARFF truck were thrown violently around in the collision. Photographs taken of the overturned truck in the hours that followed showed that the crew cab had come remarkably close, potentially a matter of inches, to taking a direct, crushing hit. Both firefighters were taken to New York Presbyterian Queens Hospital in critical condition. One was released the following afternoon. The other was held for further observation. A Frontier Airlines pilot, who was taxiing nearby and witnessed the collision, radioed the tower almost immediately. He said that wasn't good to watch. And the controller, the same controller who had cleared the truck across the runway, responded, "Yeah, I know, I was here." And then, in the minutes that followed, in a moment that has since spread across every aviation forum and news channel in this country, that same controller said something that no one in the tower or listening on frequency will ever forget. "I messed up." 3 words that carried the weight of 2 lives. 3 words from a human being sitting in a control tower, realizing in real time what had just happened. 3 words that told you everything about the moment, the raw, unfiltered reality of it. And the Frontier pilot, listening on frequency, responded, "No man, you did the best you could." I don't know that pilot's name, but whoever he is, in one of the quietest, most human moments in this entire story, he reached across the radio and offered something to a stranger who desperately needed it. That exchange, those 2 sentences, that's aviation, that's people in an unthinkable situation trying to hold it together. Within hours of the collision, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, had its GO team in motion. These are the people who investigate the worst aviation accidents in the United States, the best in the world at what they do. Their job is to reconstruct what happened, minute by minute, second by second, and to understand every single factor that contributed to the outcome. NTSB Chair Jennifer Homendy and lead investigator Doug Brazy held a press conference Monday morning. And what they revealed, even in those early hours, started to paint a picture that is far more complicated than a single controller making a single mistake. First, the good news on the evidence side. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, the black boxes, were recovered from the wreckage and transporting to the NTSB's labs in Washington, D.C. for analysis. These devices are built to survive almost anything, and they did their job. The data is intact. What investigators found on the cockpit voice recorder confirmed what the ATC audio already told us. The ARFF truck was cleared to cross runway 4 by the air traffic controller. That's established. That's not in dispute. But here's a detail that changes the picture significantly. About 1 minute before the collision, an airport vehicle that was already on or near the runway made a radio transmission to the control tower. And that transmission was, in aviation parlance, stepped on. Meaning, another radio call came in at the exact same moment on the same frequency, and the two signals collided, blocking each other out. Neither one was intelligible. The source of that blocking transmission, still unidentified as of the time of this video. Investigators are working to determine who made it and what it contained. Now think about what that could mean. Could that transmission have been a warning? Could someone on the ground, on that taxiway or that runway, have been trying to alert the tower to a conflict? We don't know yet, but the NTSB does, or soon will. Now let's talk about the staffing situation in the control tower that night, because this is one of the most important and most contested elements of this investigation. According to multiple reports from the night of the accident, a single air traffic controller was handling both ground control and local air control at LaGuardia simultaneously. Two separate jobs, two separate radio frequencies. Under normal staffing conditions, these are handled by two different certified controllers. That night, by multiple accounts, one person was doing both. NTSB Chair Homendy addressed this directly in her press conference. She said her team had seen, and I want to be precise here, conflicting information about the control tower staffing that night. Different records showing different things. She said they need to verify the details before making any public statement about exactly how many certified controllers were present and what their assigned roles were. What she was clear about, what she said without any ambiguity, is that she would caution the public against pointing fingers at air traffic controllers as individuals. She said something that I think every person watching this needs to sit with. Controllers should have all the information and tools they need to do their job. This is 2026. She noted that the systems air traffic controllers are working with today are old, outdated technology, and that safety needs to improve across the board, not in one area, not on one runway, but across the entire system. Now here is another critical detail that investigators have highlighted, and this one is stunning. The ARFF truck, that massive firefighting vehicle, did not have a transponder. In aviation, a transponder is the device that broadcasts a vehicle or aircraft's position so it shows up on radar screens and electronic tracking systems. Every commercial aircraft has one. Ground vehicles at major airports, many of them have them too. They show up on the controller's radar display as a moving symbol with an identifier, even in poor visibility, even in the dark, even when the controller can't see the taxiway with their own eyes. The ARFF truck had no transponder. It was electronically invisible. The controller knew where it was only through radio communication, the same radio communication that broke down. There was no backup system, no screen showing a blip moving across runway 4, just a radio call, a clearance, and then chaos. Aviation safety experts are already calling this a textbook example of what investigators call a system-wide failure. Not one bad decision by one person, but a cascade of contributing factors that each, individually, might have been manageable. Together, they were lethal. The absence of a transponder, a potentially blocked radio warning, a controller managing two frequencies, an arriving aircraft on final with zero time to react. Every single one of those things would have had to be different to change the outcome. I have to be honest with you about something. This is not the first time I've sat down to cover a story like this, and I don't think I'm alone in saying it shouldn't keep happening. And here's the detail that almost reads like dark comedy, except it isn't funny at all. NTSB Chair Homendy mentioned at her press conference that one of her own investigators, an air traffic control specialist rushing to get from another city to the LaGuardia crash scene, was stuck in a TSA security line for over 3 hours. The NTSB had to personally intervene to get their own crash investigator onto a flight. The people investigating the broken system got delayed by the broken system. Now let's talk about what an expert said that I think gives some grim context to the severity of the physical crash itself. A retired aviation incident commander named Kurtz, speaking to CBC News, pointed out something important. The CRJ-900's fuel tanks did not rupture in the collision. The jet fuel, thousands of pounds of highly flammable liquid, did not ignite. He said that if those fuel tanks had ruptured, if that fuel had caught fire on the runway, the outcome would have been incomprehensibly worse. The survivable cabin, the section where 72 passengers were sitting, would have been engulfed. In some regards, he said, this is not as bad as it could have been. That is the bar. That is where we are. 2 pilots dead, 41 injured, 2 firefighters in hospital, and an expert is telling us it could have been the deadliest American aviation disaster in a generation. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy called the crash horrific and traveled personally to LaGuardia in response. President Trump described it as terrible and called aviation a dangerous business. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney called it deeply saddening and confirmed Canadian authorities were cooperating with the American investigation. And FAA Administrator Brian Bedford, speaking about those 2 young pilots who were killed, said he wants to make sure we do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. We've heard that before. The question is whether this time it's true. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, LaGuardia Airport went into full emergency response mode. All arriving flights were diverted. Planes that were en route to LaGuardia were turned around and sent to Newark Liberty International and John F. Kennedy International Airport instead. The entire airport was essentially closed for hours while first responders worked the scene, while investigators began arriving, while the runway was secured and cleared of debris. By the following afternoon, the FAA announced that LaGuardia would reopen, but on a reduced basis. Only certain runways would be available for operations. Runway 4, where the collision occurred, was to remain closed until at least 7 a.m. Friday morning, 4 days of closure on one of the airport's primary runways. The cascading delays and cancellations rippled through the Northeast Corridor for days. If you were flying in or out of the New York area on Monday or Tuesday, you felt this. Hundreds of flights cancelled, thousands of passengers affected. The domino effect of a single runway closure at one of the busiest airports in the country, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Air Canada's president and CEO, Michael Rousseau, released a video statement on Monday morning. He described it as a very somber day at Air Canada. He extended the airline's deepest sympathies to all those involved and said the company was working to confirm all the details regarding injuries and to support those affected. Jazz Aviation, the actual operator of the flight, issued its own statement. 2 of its employees were among the dead, 2 pilots who had come to work that Sunday night like any other shift. For the families of the captain and first officer, Monday morning meant phone calls that no family ever wants to receive. Their names had not yet been formally released as of the time this script was prepared. Authorities in both Canada and the United States working carefully to notify next of kin before any public identification. The NTSB investigation is ongoing. Chair Homendy described the debris field as extensive and said evidence collection alone could take several days. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder are being analyzed at the NTSB lab in Washington. The blocked radio transmission from 1 minute before the collision is being identified and examined. The control tower records and staffing logs are being reviewed. The final probable cause report, the definitive document that will explain, in forensic detail, every contributing factor to this collision, will take months to complete, possibly longer than a year. That is standard for major aviation accidents. The NTSB does not rush these things. They are thorough because the stakes are too high for anything less. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, speaking at a press conference on Monday, said simply, "We will not rest until the conclusion of that investigation." And the NTSB has confirmed the three primary areas they are focused on. First, the air traffic control communications and decision-making in the moments before the collision. Second, the staffing levels and protocols in the LaGuardia control tower that night. Third, the absence of a transponder on the AIFF truck and what role that played in the controller's situational awareness. Those three things together are what put a firefighting vehicle and a landing aircraft in the same place at the same time on a runway in New York City. Each one of those things, on its own, might not have been enough to cause a disaster. Together, they were. Every time I cover a story like this, I find myself thinking about the ordinary moments that came before it. The 72 passengers on that CRJ 900 who boarded a plane in Montreal expecting the worst part of their night to be a 2-hour delay. The 2 Port Authority firefighters who climbed into an AIFF truck to respond to someone else's emergency and ended up inside one of their own. The flight attendant who found herself falling through the floor of an aircraft she expected to walk off of. And most of all, I think about 2 young pilots, Canadian men who had worked hard, who had studied, trained, logged thousands of hours, passed thousands of check rides to build careers doing something they loved, who flew their last approach into LaGuardia Airport on the night of March 22, 2026. Gear down, flaps set, runway in sight. And never walked off that plane. Aviation is still statistically the safest way to travel. That is true. It will probably still be true tomorrow. But statistics are averages, and averages don't capture the individual moments when a system fails. When a truck is on a runway and a plane is on final, and one controller is doing 2 jobs with equipment that belongs in a museum, and a 40,000-pound vehicle has no way to show up on a radar screen. Those aren't acts of God. Those are choices, system choices, funding choices, policy choices, things that can be fixed if there is the will to fix them. The NTSB will produce their report. They always do, and it will be detailed and thorough and damning in the quiet, precise language that safety boards use. And then the question, as it always is, will be whether anyone in a position to act actually acts. The 2 young men who died on runway 4 deserve more than a report. They deserve a system that means the next crew on final approach never has to worry about what's on the runway waiting for them. I'll be following this investigation as it develops. When the NTSB releases new findings, I'll be here to break them down for you. Subscribe so you don't miss those updates, and if you have questions, drop them in the comments below. I read everything. Until next time, fly safe.